Modern problems require modern solutions. And what you are looking at now are those modern solutions. No, I am not saying that specifically because drones are getting produced here. Rather, it is the manufacturing process itself that allows them to fill a void that legacy military contractors have left. Let me explain. At the risk of making an understatement, Ukraine is embarrassingly underarmed. What is happening along Europe's eastern flank right now is a proxy war between NATO and Russia. And if that was not clear, Russia accidentally flying 20 or so drones into Poland is all the evidence that you need. And if that still was not clear, Russia accidentally flying some MiG-31s into Estonian airspace is all the evidence that you need times 2. But if this is a proxy war, it, in theory, should not be close. NATO countries collectively have a GDP of around $54 trillion. Russia's GDP is $2 trillion, which, scaling font sizes accordingly, would look like this. However you may wish to adjust for purchasing power, Russia should be overwhelmed. But that is not the case. Russia continues to creep westward, slowly but consistently. Add just under 600 square kilometers to the total from the previous month. Some of the difference is that Russia has way more people, and has some North Korean soldiers to boot. Still, an equal part of the problem is that the West has not properly equipped Ukraine for the challenge, a failure that both sides of the Atlantic share. And yet, there may still be a simple solution to the problem, not in the massive factories that normally define the prime defense contractors, but rather in the ordinary backyards of average people like you and me, and in modest production facilities of seemingly normal civilian companies. The Bankroll Problem. In the West, the vast majority of military spending is not done by our respective government's employees. Rather, the spending goes through private contractors. A government decides that it needs something. It solicits bids from those defense contractors. Each interested defense contractor looks at what the government wants, thinks about what the company is capable of doing, and quotes the government a price. The government looks at the bids and selects the best, balancing price with the various contractors' reported specifications and plausibility that they can produce what they claim. Thus, defense production is at the mercy of government budgets. No money, no metal. You likely know the deeper story of how a good chunk of that money went away, and thus, so did a bunch of that metal. The Cold War ended, and Western defense budgets shriveled up, the peace dividend and all that. And, you know what? It made sense. The Western world was no longer under the same threat that it once was. With the walls torn down, it would be better to lower taxes and make more productive investments than sink cash into weapons of war. The United States and others could finally pull back on the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower had warned about 3 decades earlier. But then Russia annexed Crimea, NATO allies in Wales agreed to spend 2% of GDP on defense, very few of them made fundamental changes to their budgets, Russia invaded the rest of Ukraine, and then the allies at The Hague decided to raise core defense spending targets to 3.5%. Moreover, there is a general sense that the allies are actually making movements here. The 3.5%, or something like that, seems to be happening. So, problem solved. Right? The Last Supper. The date was July 21st, 1993. Every major U.S. defense contractor had been summoned to Washington, but none of them knew why. The whispers around the Pentagon indicated that, whatever was happening, it was not good news for them. Les Aspin had become the Secretary of Defense exactly 6 months earlier. Previously, he was a representative from Wisconsin, and widely known as a skeptic of post-Cold War DoD spending. Also telling, President Clinton had campaigned on a bottom-up review of the defense budget, after the Persian Gulf War stalled George H.W. Bush's disbursement of the peace dividend. After a quick meal inside of the Pentagon, Aspen corralled the defense contractors into a conference room and turned things over to Deputy Secretary of Defense William Perry. The refrigerator, you may ask? No, he was about to put spending in the freezer. Perry showed the contractors a graph of projected military spending over the next few years. It pointed exactly where you might expect. What followed was more or less an ultimatum. The reduced budget would be insufficient to support dozens of prime contractors. Either merge or go out of business. The contractors listened and chose the former. Companies like Northrop Corporation and Grumman Corporation became Northrop Grumman. Very original naming scheme. Companies like Lockheed and Martin Marietta became Lockheed Martin. I'm detecting a pattern here. Norm Augustine, who was the CEO of Martin Marietta at the time of all of this chaos, and would later become the CEO of Lockheed Martin, called it the Last Supper of the defense industry. Augustine's flair for the dramatic aside, Clinton got what he wanted: a more streamlined defense industry, capable of surviving an inflation-adjusted 26% cut in spending from 1991 to 1996. But it came at a cost: the loss of spare capacity. With purchase orders from the Pentagon dropping, the merged companies were not about to keep redundant factories idle. Instead, they simply closed their doors. And no shade to Clinton here. It was the right call for American taxpayers given the context at the time. That context was not a growing threat to the then emerging New World Order. Rather, Augustine likes to tell an anecdote from his trip to China in 1978. He was one of the first Americans to go there, and the locals were curious and, well, puzzled. They had heard that people in the United States were wealthy. But how wealthy? They inquired about the number of bicycles that Americans owned, because that was the everyman metric of wealth in China at the time. Sure, China had its fair share of cars back then, but cars seemed like an unobtainable luxury item to the ordinary Chinese citizen. Well, that was only 15 years before William Perry's Last Supper announcement. In 1993, China's GDP was only $1 trillion. By 2024, it had jumped to $38 trillion. But it was the 1993 figure that set the Clinton administration's mindset at the time. It would be another decade until anyone started talking about an Indo-Pacific pivot, and 15 years until there was any remote sincerity behind it. Now, the Clinton administration's goal was to keep the Department of Defense agile over the upcoming years, lest it run into problems down the line. 3 decades later, we have run into problems down the line. The gap. Econ Pop Quiz. In the short run, what happens when supply is fixed, but demand increases? The answer? Prices go up, but production remains constant. That is the problem that Western governments are about to confront. A defense budget increase from 2% to 3.5% of GDP would seem to buy a ton more metal. But that assumes that the metal exists to be purchased, and the Last Supper has something to say about that. Without excess factory capacity, defense contractors can barely scale up production. Maybe they can add a shift here or there, but they are not going to increase production by the 75% that the Hague Summit would need them to. In fact, NATO is well aware of this problem. This is why the jump from 2% to 3.5% will be spaced out over multiple years. Part of this is to give allied governments time to figure out how to find the extra money in the budget. But another part is to give defense contractors time to expand capacity. Otherwise, the alliance will just pay more for almost the exact same amount of stuff. If 1993 was the Last Supper, then 2025 is the first breakfast. One issue, though: we are not yet eating. Unfortunately, manufacturers cannot build their signature massive metal monstrosities overnight. The defense contractors still need to set the table. That leaves a yawning gap for the alliance to bridge in the meantime. And nowhere is this problem more apparent than in Ukraine. Yes, we all know how Kyiv would love more 155mm shells. The problem is that those things go boom, and if they do not go boom correctly, then you may go boom as you try to launch one. It turns out that precision and explosion are not a good combination for rapid mass production. This is what 80 155mm shells look like if you detonate them at the same time. Regardless, the problem goes up and down the line. Remember that NATO program for European countries to buy weapons from the United States to send to Ukraine? Well, it is a bit more complicated than that. The program is called PEARL, Priority Ukraine Requirements List. Emphasis on priority. The United States is not making additional weapons that then just so happen to go to Ukraine. At least, that is not what is happening in the short run. You see, one cannot make additional weapons in this sense when one is already operating at maximum capacity. Rather, European purchasers just get to jump the line, receiving their orders ahead of others who had reserved earlier spots. It is the same problem all over again. There is also a more subtle issue. Consolidation following the Last Supper eventually reduced the United States to 5 primary defense contractors: Lockheed Martin, RTX Corporation, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman. Whereas the Cold War defense contracting economy felt closer to a competitive market because of the abundance of the contractors, today's situation feels more like an oligopoly. Undoubtedly, those companies will want to expand to some degree to capture a larger portion of the defense pie. But such expansions require enormous capital outlays, and unlike a fully competitive market, oligopolies tend to find a way to move slowly here. After all, the less that they expand, the higher prices that they can collectively command, which in turn yields collectively higher profits. Again, this is a problem that the Clinton administration foresaw. More than 30 years later, though, it is now time for the United States to resolve the problem. Modern solutions. There is no getting around it. Solving the short-term problem requires brand new weapons technologies and the corresponding new contractors to produce them. However, this would seem to take us right back to the original problem. In addition to the legacy defense contractors struggling to build capital-heavy factory space that also takes a long time to build, the weapons themselves are long-term projects. HIMARS, arguably the star of the war in Ukraine, is a great example of this issue. Its first prototype was built in 1991, a full 14 years before its first deployment, way too long for the demands of the current security situation. But the star power of HIMARS aside, a new technology has become the everyman of the battlefield. Welcome to the drone age. And, as luck would have it, many types of drones have basically the exact opposite qualities of legacy weapons. They tend to be relatively cheap, they do not inherently go boom, but they can stow things in abundance that do go boom, and can house them under relatively safe conditions. Best of all, though, they are essentially consumer goods. That means civilian companies can switch over to drone production without much hassle. Boom. Instant expansion of military production. Exactly what NATO needs in the short run, and exactly what Ukraine can benefit from right now. Let me give you a case study of what this looks like. This is Neros, an American-based drone manufacturer. They are almost a perfect example of what I just described. The company has its origins in recreational drone racing, but then made the military pivot when it became apparent that the technology was useful for, well, more lethal activities. They now produce 2,000 drones per month, more than any other US manufacturer. Of course, that is but a small fraction of Ukraine's current needs, never mind the broader Western coalitions. Last I could find, Ukraine goes through 200,000 drones a month, though that rate seems to increase exponentially, so it is probably out of date by the time that you are watching this. The shortfall is just a part of why companies like Neros need to expand, and more companies like Neros need to enter the market. A couple of issues stand in way of defense proliferation in the civilian sector, though: R&D and supply chain procurement. On the R&D side of things, the problem is one of capital. Small companies lack the resources to make significant R&D outlays to bring new products to the market. However, NATO is aware of this problem and is looking for solutions. Enter Allied Command Transformation, headquartered in Norfolk, Virginia. ACT, as it is abbreviated, normally has the task of thinking and adapting NATO strategy to what war might look like in 5 to 10 years. However, earlier in 2025, its Task Force X division received orders to figure out how to protect the Baltic Sea, and to get results in months, not years. Well, sticking to that goal, within months, they were already working with industry to prototype drones to monitor the waters. And let me tell you, the story of what happened there was so wild that I need to save it for its own video, which, if you will remember the last time that I mentioned this, will likely come out in October 2037 at the rate things that are happening in the world. The recently announced Eastern Sentry Initiative to defend NATO's eastern flank from Russian drone incursions also tasked ACT with developing new solutions to the problem. It remains to be seen whether traditionally civilian sector companies will contribute there. Nonetheless, given how cheaply Russia can produce its Shahed-style drones, there is certainly hope that even cheaper civilian solutions can counteract them. For now, the second problem is securing supply chains. Well, actually, that is not a problem in an absolute sense. There is an endless stream of components available from China. One hiccup. There is an endless stream of components available from China. And that does not seem like a good place to be in the event of World War III, even as Ukraine ultimately sources a lot of its drone components from Russia's limitless partner. Thus, another outlet for all of the money is to ramp up domestic manufacturing of the component parts. That is why, for example, the International Drone Capability Coalition, a collection of Western countries, is not just interested in supplying drones to Ukraine, or even manufacturing drones in the West. They also want the supply chains to be in the West. The overall point is that war is no longer uniquely in the domain of heavy industry, neither in terms of the prime contractors, nor the rest of the large-scale civilian industrial companies that transformed into weapons manufacturers during World War II. It has gone small-scale, and that is something that the West can use to bridge the gap. The future of war. I ought to emphasize the word bridging in bridging the gap, because this is not about converting fully to an army of lightweight drones. It is tempting to look at the battles in Ukraine and conclude that war has fundamentally changed. And let there be no doubt, drones would have a major role to play in any conflict between NATO and Russia, be it terrestrial strikes along the Baltic Sea or monitoring terrestrial fronts from above. Same as would be the case for a war in the Pacific, for that matter. However, Ukraine is fighting its own war its own way. The fact is that Ukraine's limitations dictate the battle strategy that it has developed. Ukraine cannot engage in combined arms maneuvers, one, because it is not a part of Ukrainian doctrine, and two, because Ukraine does not have the air force to do it. Even in the age of drones, NATO's war plan will begin and end with combined arms maneuvers. That means flying a fleet over to the other side and destroying everything that remotely resembles a supply line. Against Ukraine, Russia can hold the zone with a host of drone operators nearby. Destroy all of the supply lines behind them, however, and they will run out of food and water in a few days. Suddenly, all of those drone operators vanish, and so do their drones. NATO can go back to the maneuver warfare that it wants to use. Nonetheless, the more drones that go to Ukraine, the longer Russia will be tied down figuring out what to do there. That buys the West more time to ramp up production on the other fronts, and prepare for a possible World War III. Meanwhile, you can prepare for World War III by checking out these two books on the current war. Actually, just kidding. They will do nothing to prepare you for World War III. Then again, who knows? You may find them recreationally enjoyable today. If that sounds like your cup of tea, then check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.